Good YouTube? It's your boy, Blue Blood Sports TV, back at y'all with another one. So, seems like undefeated, unified WBC, IBF welterweight world champion superstar boxer, who is widely considered by many to be top 3 best pound-for-pound fighters in the world, and Errol "The Truth" Spence Jr., 27 wins, no losses, no draws, 21 wins by way of knockout. Errol Spence is 31 years of age, stands at 5'9.5", with a 72-inch arm reach. With that said, last time we saw Errol Spence in the ring was December of 2020 when he took on and defeated 2-division world champion, former unified junior welterweight world champion, former WBC welterweight world champion, and Puerto Rican superstar boxer Danny Swift Garcia. And he did so coming off a 14-month layoff after suffering a horrific car accident just 12 days after unifying the titles against 2-time welterweight world champion superstar boxer Showdown Shawn Porter. So with that said, Errol Spence, he dominated the fight. He nearly won every single round except the rounds he chose to take off. And he proved that he's still Errol Spence that we know. And he stated that he wasn't even 80% of himself. Now with that said, Errol Spence was supposed to come back August 21st of this year and take on legendary 8-division iconic Filipino superstar boxer world champion Manny "Pac-Man" Pacquiao. But Errol Spence, he suffered a eye injury, detached broken retina, which saw him have to be pulled from the fight and go into immediate surgery. Now, Errol Spence, he was expecting to go into a unification bout after everything was revealed with Cuban star boxer who replaced him as the main event against Manny Pacquiao, who had been elevated to the WBA, World Boxing Association's super champion, because Manny Pacquiao, he beat former unified undefeated welterweight world champion superstar boxer Keith "One-Time" Thurman July of 2019. And because of the pandemic and because of inactivity, the WBA claimed that they were putting Manny Pacquiao as champion in recess due to his inactivity and due to the fact that he wasn't willing to fight a fighter in the top 10 ranking system of the WBA sanction body. And so they elevated the regular champion, YORDENIS UGAS, Cuban star boxer, to super champion. And when Errol Spence had to be pulled from the fight, it just made sense to use YORDENIS UGAS, who opponent pulled out of the fight due to eye injury, which is former world champion, a welterweight superstar boxer Marcos El Chino Madonna's brother, Fabian Madonna, was supposed to fight YORDENIS UGAS as the co-main event. He had to pull out with an eye injury, so YORDENIS UGAS didn't have an opponent, so he replaced Errol Spence. And it just made sense because he was elevated super. Manny Pacquiao, he petitioned to become, to be reinstated as the champion in the WBA, who apologized after Manny Pacquiao stated that they never informed him that this was going to be the case, that the WBA never contacted him, and that he put the WBA on the spot. And he revealed they weren't doing good business, and he wasn't happy. And Manny Pacquiao is a global iconic superstar, so that got a lot of waves, and it caught a lot of it caught a lot of momentum. And so the WBA, they wanted to fan it out and put it out, and they apologized for not doing things correctly with Manny Pacquiao. So they still didn't elevate him and reinstate him back as super champion, but it didn't have to because he was facing YORDENIS UGAS anyway. So now he faced YORDENIS UGAS, but he lost a unanimous decision. So YORDENIS UGAS became the WBA super champion officially now, okay? It was expected that YORDENIS UGAS and Errol Spence Jr. would go into unification bout February of 2022. They already had a contract and a deal in place. Well, the WBA, they threw a wrench in the plans, and now the WBA has decided to place a tournament on YORDENIS UGAS, and he has to fight rising star boxer Stanionis in the tournament, right? That's going to see Jamal James enter his tournament, and he's going to fight Butev on this upcoming Saturday night. And YORDENIS UGAS has to fight Stanionis, okay? Well, it looks like the WBA and, YORDENIS UGAS are at odds, okay? And they can't come to an agreement. And so if you look at their standings right now, they have taken YORDENIS UGAS off the standings, and they have Jamal James as the super champion. Okay, and they have replaced Yordenis Ugas, he's not even on the list. Okay. And so with that said, Yordenis Ugas says they're doing bad business. They promised him some that he would be able to fight, Errol Spence in a unification bout. And it just goes back and forth, etc. With that said, World Boxing Council President Mauricio Suleiman has decided to elevate another opponent in the ranking system for Errol Spence Jr., that being Vergil Ortiz Jr., rising undefeated Mexican superstar boxer, 18 wins, no losses, no draws, 18 wins by way of knockout, 23 years of age, 5'10" with a 70-inch arm reach. Last time he was in the ring was against UGAS Velasquez. That was August of this year. He faced some adversity in that fight, and he weathered the storm, got the TKO victory. So they decided to elevate, Vergil Ortiz Jr. now as the number one mandatory opponent for Errol Spence Jr. Okay, so now Errol Spence Jr. could possibly be facing Vergil Ortiz Jr. in his next fight, which is going to speak volumes, because that's a mega fight, because Vergil Ortiz is from Texas. Vergil Ortiz Jr., is from, the same place as Errol Spence Jr. They have history. They even had a bit of, words at one point in time, they went back and forth, and Vergil Ortiz, he said, I did nothing but respect Errol Spence and show him love, and, he felt slighted by some comments made by Errol Spence. Well, now Errol Spence is the champion, obviously, and now Vergil Ortiz is the number one mandatory challenger. Mikey Garcia is at number 2, who Errol Spence already beaten. David Avanesian is at number 3. Keith Thurman is at number 4. Danny Garcia is at 5. And surprisingly, Jerron Boots Ennis, who will be fighting this weekend, is at number 2, number 6, and rising. Then you have Conor Ben at number 7. So now, Errol Spence Jr. could be in a position where he has to face his mandatory. He stated on his social media he has no interest, zero interest in fighting guys that don't have a belt. But obviously, in order for him to keep his belts, he has to fight his mandatories. So his mandatory in the IBF, he has an IBF mandatory that's due, and now Vergil Ortiz Jr. is his mandatory, which makes sense because it's a bigger fight for him to face off against Vergil Ortiz Jr. than to fight against his IBF mandatory, who's relatively unknown. So for him to fight, against Vergil Ortiz Jr., is a much bigger fight for Errol Spence. It's a much more meaningful fight for Errol Spence. And you could sell it as a pay-per-view fight for Errol Spence. So Errol Spence's mandatory is Kudratillo Abdul Agarov. So that's Errol Spence's mandatory, who is also an unbeaten fighter. He is also, a guy who's unbeaten, he's looking to make headlines. He's looking to make waves. He's looking to get his opportunity to fight against Errol Spence Jr. The problem is he's unknown. Nobody knows who he is. He's undefeated, but it's not a big fight. Errol Spence is looking for pay-per-view fights. He's looking for the biggest fights possible, and this is just not a fight Errol Spence is interested in taking, obviously, but Errol Spence wouldn't have a choice if he wants to keep a hold of his belts. He would have to fight his IBF mandatory, or he could go the route of fighting his WBC mandatory. Vergil Ortiz Jr. is a much bigger fight, and you can best believe the WBC, World Boxing Council, and Mauricio Suleiman is going to push that that Vergil Ortiz gets his opportunity to fight Errol Spence for the world title. And again, imagine Errol Spence versus Vergil Ortiz at Dallas Cowboys Stadium in Texas. That would be a complete sellout. That would be enormous. A pay-per-view, and it's a pay-per-view fight. Errol Spence versus I can't pronounce his name, but Errol Spence versus that gentleman, is not a pay-per-view fight. You understand? You can't sell that fight as a pay-per-view event. You can sell Errol Spence versus Vergil Ortiz Jr., who has 18 wins, no loss, no draws, and 18 wins by knockout. And they're fighting. He has a huge Mexican fan base, and they're fighting in both their hometown. So it's not to get away from either which guy's hometown, okay? It's a hometown fight for both guys. At Dallas Cowboys Stadium would be an enormous sellout, okay? Because 4-division world champion Mexican superstar boxer Mikey Garcia was a huge fight, okay? And it fought in Texas because of the huge Mexican fan base. But Mikey Garcia is from California. He's not from Texas. Vergil Ortiz has a huge Mexican fan base in Texas, and he's from Texas, from the same city as Errol Spence. They have the same similar circles, you know, not saying they run in the same circles, but they have a similar fan base. So you bring them together at Cowboy Stadium, it's a sellout, and you can sell it on pay-per-view. So it makes more sense if Errol Spence can't get the fight with Yordenis Ugas, as it looks like that's not going to happen. Errol Spence versus Vergil Ortiz Jr., expect to see that be in the next fight. It's not a coincidence to see the WBC place Vergil Ortiz Jr. as the #1 mandatory challenger for Errol Spence. Now, Errol Spence, he could pay his IBF mandatory step-aside money to allow this fight to take place. Then, after this fight with Vergil Ortiz, you get that fight done. Fight Vergil Ortiz in February. Massive pay-per-view. Dallas Cowboys Showdown in Texas. Enormous. And then after that fight, to stay busy, as Errol Spence said, he wants to fight 2 to 3 times in 2022. So you fight him in February. I believe Errol Spence is going to win the fight. I believe that Vergil Ortiz's style is tailor-made for Errol Spence. He's not very mobile. He's flat-footed. Now, he does have power. Errol Spence have to be aware, but Errol Spence is versatile enough to offset what Vergil Ortiz does. Errol Spence is just as big as Vergil Ortiz, so he's not going to be as much of a size. He's a half an inch taller than Errol Spence. And Errol Spence has a 2-inch arm reach advantage. Errol Spence is a better athlete. He's quicker. He's stronger. He's more accurate. And we saw Vergil Ortiz Jr. rocked and hurt badly by Igis Kavalauskas. And so you imagine if that was Errol Spence might have stopped him. So Errol Spence is a better athlete. He's more versatile. I believe Errol Spence would win this fight. And then, you say in the summertime, let's say July, you fight your mandatory, IBF mandatory, and then that gives Yordenis Ugas, he beats Stanionis, then he's going to have to fight possibly the winner of Jamal James and BOUT fight, and he already beat Jamal James, so he goes into that fight. That gives him time to, get those fights out of the way. Then you talk about in the fall, they go into unification bouts. Or Ugas may go the route of Terrence Crawford, who knows? But this gives Errol Spence, the opportunity to fight a big fight, pay-per-view. Now he keeps his streak of pay-per-views going against Vergil Ortiz Jr. Then you get a summertime fight against your mandatory, okay? And then in the fall, you go into a unification bouts, possibly against Terrence Crawford. If Terrence Crawford is able to get the Yordenis Ugas fight, who knows? The WBA seems to be steadfast on making Yordenis Ugas fight in these tournaments, or they're going to strip him. So who knows what's going to happen? So let's see. But this just makes sense for Errol Spence, and it makes sense for Vergil Ortiz. And Errol Spence just have to pay his IBF mandatory some step-aside money, but promise him to fight him later on. So let's see how this unfolds and plays out. But that's all I got for y'all. Make sure you hit the like button. Drop a comment in the comment section. Let me know what y'all think. Y'all already know what it is. It's your boy Blue, Blue Blood Sports TV. Hate, like, comment, and subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the bell icon to get all the new notification. Follow me on Instagram at Blue Blood Sports TV, all one word. Y'all already know what it is. Shout out to the entire LDBC. Shout out to New Media. Shout out to Black Media Row. Make sure you like and share the videos. That's all I got for y'all. Peace.
You're watching Blue Blood Sports TV. Wow.